and thank you so much for coming today. My name is Karen Benson. I'm very privileged to be the CEO here at Multicultural Development Association, and very, very excited today to introduce you to a colleague of mine, Paris Aristotle, and a long-term friend. Paris, at the end of June last year, was asked by the Prime Minister to be part of an expert panel to make recommendations to the government as an independent expert panel about issues relating to asylum. We're really, really pleased here at MDA to have him here today to talk with you and answer your questions about the expert panel's recommendations. I know that there's been a lot of commentary in the press, there's been a lot of talk in the sector about the recommendations. So we're really, really pleased here in Queensland to have an opportunity to talk with Paris directly about that. So for today, the format for today is I'm going to introduce Senator Claire Moore to introduce Paris formally. Paris is going to give us a bit of an overview of the report, but a fairly short overview, and then it's our opportunity to ask questions of him. He's asked me to encourage you all to ask the really hard questions. So ask the questions that you really want to know. But this is not a forum today for us to make statements about what we think. It's a forum today to hear from Paris. So I'd ask you all to frame your questions, make them hard, ask what you really want to know, but I'm going to, we're not going to have big statements of your own personal opinions from the floor. So that's pretty much the ground rules for today. It's a great pleasure to introduce Senator Claire Moore. Senator Moore has been a long-term member of MDA and has been one of the most supportive members of Parliament in Queensland of refugee and migrant issues. So please make Claire welcome.
Good morning, everyone. And I always begin by acknowledging the traditional owners and paying my respects to elders of all cultures, and I think particularly here. Paris, you are not going to get an introduction. You don't need an introduction. You know, people say someone doesn't need an introduction and goes on for 20 minutes introducing them. The fact that I'm so pleased I can be here because it's a holiday in Canberra, so I haven't got to go back until tonight. But no pressure at all, Paris, but this is such a difficult area and such a difficult subject, and I have to admit, when we were told that we were going to go with the independent panel and that we were given the names of the people on the panel, that was the one saving grace for me sitting in that room. And when I heard your name, I felt stronger about the whole process that we were in. You would all understand that it is an extraordinarily sensitive and difficult area, and I don't think anyone has ever or will ever get it absolutely right. But the government was determined that we would have some independent information coming into us, trying very hard to keep it as much of the politics out of it as we possibly can. Now, you can make your assessments whether we succeeded on that, but in terms of the way the process worked, I was so thrilled that Paris did accept the challenge and go into the process. Really, I could sit and ask him questions for 7 hours, but I'm not going to. But one of the ones that I'm just going on your behalf, I hope you're going to tell us, Paris, why you did it. That's always been big for me. It must have been such a difficult thing to do, but everybody in this room knows the work, the commitment, the integrity of Paris Aristotle, and we're so pleased to have him here.
So Paris, tell us about the expert panel's report.
Okay. I'm assuming everybody here's read it completely. If I could just start off by answering your question, Claire, about why I did it. there have been moments where I've asked myself that very same question of late. Look, it's hard to turn a Prime Minister down. There's one easy way to say it, but I had reached the point of feeling like most people in Australia that enough was enough, really, that the way in which we were handling this issue as a country was, and debating it, was debasing what we do. And it was not offering us any long-term vision about how we could change the dynamics so that we could protect more people in safer ways. I also was confronted in my work at both ends of the spectrum. So we still have clients at my work who were on Nauru the first time round, and I suspect some of them probably won't work again and were harmed as a consequence of that, the way in which that operated. So that was one side of it that was troubling for me. The other side was that we were having increasing numbers of clients who were losing family on boats. The boat that went down with 220 people or so that drowned, we had 3 clients. One had 6 members of their family who drowned. Another had 5 members of their family who drowned on that boat. Another had 3. And I would visit detention centres regularly and be asked by people for news about brothers or fathers or uncles who they knew they had departed some 6-9 months ago, but they hadn't heard from them since. And there's really only one answer for that, given how IT literate people are, much more than me, that's for sure. So the issue, I did think about it momentarily. The issue for me was it had gone past the point, the loss of life was going past the point that I thought was acceptable and that we needed to do something different. I knew it was going to end up very problematic for me in some ways because the dynamics had changed a lot. But at the end of the day, I basically thought I had to have a go at it. So there was certainly a lot of risks to my reputation and my work and all of that sort of stuff associated with it, but very clear on what the intent was. I should also say that I didn't know Angus Houston or Michael Lestrange before I joined the panel. And a number of people have said to me, oh, gee, it must have been really difficult for you, Paris, or they had this view or perspective that I was a moderating voice amongst those two and so forth. And I just would like to say publicly that that really wasn't the case. I wasn't a harsher voice, but they were very focused and committed to an independent process and to providing the best advice they could about a better pathway. That was the intent from the outset, and they stuck to that admirably. There was never a debate about increasing the quota. We tossed around whether to go higher, whether to go lower. There was never a debate around the regional framework. In fact, you'll see the first two parts of this report are actually about building a better regional framework. All of the attention has been about Nauru and Manus, and I'm very happy to come and talk about that later. I can also say a couple of things about how we approached it. We wrote the report ourselves. A lot of people think that when you do this, someone else writes the report, you just tell them what to do. But we wrote the report ourselves, and we had a group of people that did research for us on questions that we gave them. And we had over 500 submissions that we went through, and we held rounds of consultations. The principal author was in fact Michael Lestrange, because he's a very nice writer. And we met, in the first week we met with the Prime Minister, the Minister, the Opposition, Tony Abbott, Julie Bishop, Scott Morrison, Peter Credlin. we met with the Greens, and we met with independents, and then we started a process of meeting NGOs. We did not go back to any of the political parties after that first week because we had asked the Prime Minister, or actually before we'd suggested to the Prime Minister that we didn't want to report to the government, we wanted to report to the Parliament. She in fact had made that point to us just before the words came out of Angus's mouth anyway. Now, I make that point because a number of people, including one of the political parties, made very strong claims that that wasn't the case. And I just want to put on record that Angus's integrity and Michael's integrity was such that they were determined that this would be independent and that we would do the work ourselves. I was a bit cranky about that because it's not easy doing something with someone who spent his life in the military and gets up in a Canberra winter at 5 in the morning and runs up a bloody hill and then says, I'll pick you up at 7. It wasn't my idea of a great night, but or morning. But that's how we did the process. And I just want to put that on the record because any concerns I may have had going into it about the integrity of the panel on those levels were dispelled very quickly, and I think it's important to acknowledge that. To do them some justice, I don't normally do this, and of course you've all memorised it, so I'm apologising in advance for going over it again. But I just wanted to pluck a couple of paragraphs out of the foreword of the report because it was written by the three of us and it was a panel, and in setting the context for it, I just want to give you some of the words of the panel so you have a sense of what our thinking was. So if you can bear with me, I'll read it. I'll read a few of the paragraphs. We've applied an overriding priority to addressing the complex and difficult task we've been given. That priority has been to consult in good faith, to base our deliberations on the merits of different points of view, and to propose a way forward that meets the tests of reasonableness, fairness and humanitarian need. In proposing a way forward, our guiding light has been to find practical ways in which to advance the Australian national interest in achieving progress towards the goal of more effective regional cooperation on asylum issues. There are no quick fixes or simple solutions to the policy dilemmas and the humanitarian challenges that asylum seeking create. In addressing these dilemmas and meeting those challenges, we believe that Australian policy can and should be hard-headed but not hard-hearted, that practicality and fairness should take precedence over theory and inertia, and that the perfect should not be allowed to become the enemy of the good. We believe that in the current impasse on Australian policy making and in relation to asylum issues, it is not a viable option for the future. We believe the current impasse is not a viable option. The prospect of further losses of life at sea is one that demands urgent and decisive action on the part of the Australian Parliament. We believe that no single focus can provide an effective basis for policy making. This is true whether the focus is on better protections for asylum seekers or on disincentives to discourage them from taking dangerous maritime voyages. The loss of life on dangerous maritime voyages in search of Australia's protection has been increasing. The number of irregular maritime arrivals who have arrived in Australia in the first 7 months of 2012 was 7,120, has exceeded the number who arrived in total in 2011 and 2010. The likelihood that more people will lose their lives is high and unacceptable. These realities have changed the circumstances that Australia now faces. They are why new, comprehensive and integrated strategies for responding are needed. Those strategies need to shift the balance of Australian policies and regional arrangements to give greater hope and confidence to asylum seekers that regional arrangements will work more effectively and to discourage more actively the use of irregular maritime voyages. In this context, the panel believes that to do nothing when there is the ability to do more is unacceptable. Rather than denying asylum seekers the right to take terrible risks, there is a responsibility to create opportunities that would enable their claims to be processed more fairly and effectively in ways that makes those risks unnecessary. Now, I'll just stop it at that part of it. But that was the overriding thrust from the panel's perspective of why we've gone down this pathway. Now, in saying that, I'm very clear that there are very serious and deep concerns about some of the recommendations, and there are significant ethical and moral dilemmas that are tied up in all of this. And if I can just put to you the ethical conundrum that we were grappling with, if that's okay. On the one side, people argue that you should not intervene to prevent someone from seeking asylum, even if they risk their lives doing that. Refugees risk their lives all over the world. I understand that argument and that ethical debate position, and it's actually one that I've held. In arguing that position, people advocate that it's a refugee's decision to take that risk on that boat, and we shouldn't do anything to impede that risk, that decision. So I understand the ethics of that, but I'll come back to it in a sec. The other side of that ethical conundrum which we were tossing up was, well, with the increased rate of people dying, and if you have the ability to do something about that and to protect more people, should you intervene to prevent people taking those risks? And for us, we came down on that side of the equation. We felt, and with all of the intelligence that we were given, some published, some not, that the rate of arrivals was on the increase. It had reached about 1,800, and then by the time we finished the panel, the last month of our work, or the last 2 months, I think, the number of arrivals for each of those months had exceeded 2,000 per month. We came down on the side of that ethical conundrum that you needed to do something to intervene. In doing that, we felt the most critical thing was to create a regional framework that had more places in it for people, that was resourced so that NGOs and civil society groups could develop services and programs to help stabilise populations in the region, to help care for people while they're going through this process, and that was the most critical thing for us to work towards and build. The second part of it was that in building that framework and creating a regional model, it would collapse very quickly if no one had to stay in it. If you couldn't put people into that model and process them in a timely and fair way, everybody that is, then it would erode the efficacy of that model. And with the High Court having knocked over the Malaysia arrangement for some very justifiable reasons, and with Indonesia not really being very accepting of any of our position on these issues, particularly since the Oceanic Viking and the Merrick incident a couple of years ago, there were very few options for trying to create disincentives for people to go around that system. And because of the immediacy of the increase in arrivals and that it would take time to renegotiate things with Malaysia and then hopefully down the track Indonesia, we ultimately made recommendations about the use of Nauru and Manus Island for processing asylum seekers. That was a very difficult decision for someone in my position to make or to agree with. And as a consequence, because we knew the risks, and as a consequence we established a series of safeguards that should be in place for that processing. One was that however things were run, it needed to comply with international humanitarian obligations. And the example we used in brackets was including no arbitrary detention. It also includes no refoulement. It needed to provide for legal assistance to assist people to prepare their claims. It needed to provide health and mental health services and educational and vocational training programs. It needed a case management model. It should have advisory and oversight mechanisms that would monitor the adherence to those international obligations and report on those sorts of things. Did I mention the provision of legal assistance? And in addition to the provision of legal assistance, there would be a review, a merits review of those decisions. In our report, we recommended in a process that included not only officials but non-government representation. So we recommended a series of safeguards because we knew that there were serious risks with it. And even in recommending them, we all held fears that the risks would, that it wouldn't eventuate in the way in which we'd envisaged it, and I'll come back to that. The difference was we were owning all of that. And when I've had this debate with other colleagues who adopt the position that I would formally have adopted as well about not intervening, where people usually stop short in that argument is in saying, well, we don't believe you should intervene, and in the current context, that means more people will lose their lives at sea, will die. But we think, on balance, that is more acceptable than the proposals that you're taking. I've never met anyone who would want anyone to die at sea, by the way. None of the people that I'm talking about would want that and would absolutely prefer that never happened. But that is the reality. So my point to them is we're owning the risks associated with Nauru and Manus, which is why we've established safeguards. You need to own all of your side of the ethical position as well. You can't just accept and own the bits that you're comfortable with. There are other realities as well. So that was if you like, the ethical conundrum. And the reason why I've gone to some length to explain that is how we built steps around this. Now, if I can just put out there the other thing which has sent me into orbit on numerous occasions is tied to the concept of the no advantage principle, which has created a great deal of angst. It's a difficult concept to understand, and it needs a lot of work, actually, to make it functional. But if I can just take the opportunity so you can hear from the horse's mouth what was intended with the no advantage principle. It's nothing like some senators have presented or commentators have presented, and actually nothing like some government decisions have reflected. So if I can just take the opportunity to explain that. The no advantage principle is fundamentally about trying to create, in a regional model of processing, a guiding principle of fairness. People kept referring to it as a test. There is no test. There is no exact mathematical formula, as some authors have searched for in such a complex and difficult and volatile environment. It was a guiding principle that was meant to help think through the way in which you would try to make sure that a woman with children in Malaysia or Indonesia or wherever who didn't have the same resources or capacities as another person who may have been more mobile, had more access to resources, whatever, did not just keep staying there and being overlooked in a humanitarian regional processing model because people could keep going around that model. That was what it was intended to do. It was intended to try to create in a regional model some guiding principle of what would be fair, not just for people who get within our immediate view, but for those who we don't even get to see within the region. Now, people keep wanting to boil it down to being about time. It's not just about time, and in fact, that's not the underpinning principle of it. the primary disincentive of the no advantage principle is a financial one. If I can put it in these terms so that it's clear, if, for example, on Nauru you had a family and in Indonesia you had a family and they were being processed and they at roughly the same sort of time and they had similar circumstances and so forth, and under this principle, the family in Indonesia would be processed and would be granted a visa. There is no reason why the family being processed in Nauru at the same time needs to wait another 3, 4, or someone has said 5 years before they would get access to resettlement. What would happen is that they would receive a visa roughly at the same time, perhaps a bit longer, but roughly speaking at the same time. And the principal disincentive is that the person on Nauru, if they're an individual, probably spent $20,000 getting there. If they're a family, $30,000 to $40,000 getting there. The person in Indonesia will be flown here for free. It was not about let's put people somewhere and tell them they're going to be there for a long time so we can project an image to other people who don't ever pay attention to those things, by the way, that this is awful and horrible and you're going to be left here to rot. It was never about that from our perspective, and the way in which it's been represented in many circumstances has in fact been wrong and erroneous. Now, we had 6 weeks to do this work. I don't know if people saw the report. It's a reasonable amount of work to have done in a 6-week period when very few had done anything comparable in such a compressed time. So elaborating on how that principle would work, and it is complex, we couldn't actually do in the body of the report. But it was not solely about time at all. You needed to do it on a case-by-case basis. It would need to incorporate vulnerability. It would need to incorporate risk. There are instruments around the world like the Heightened Risk Intervention and Assessment Tool, the Best Interest Determination process. There are assessments around women at risk programs. There's a UNHCR handbook on resettlement. There are instruments and tools available that are used all of the time to help manage this in difficult circumstances. So that's what it was about, and I'm sure there'll be lots of questions about it as well. But when I hear people say, oh, well, it's 60 years in Malaysia, or it's 12,000 years somewhere else, someone printed, it's ridiculous. So that's the challenge for us. It was we couldn't do it in the context, and it's the responsibility of the department now to articulate and put more flesh on the bones of that principle. But it's not about the punitive, punishing type mentality that sometimes it's been derived about. And there's a question in here about whether it also was about removing work rights for people, and I'll just tell you up front, and we can come to the question later, it was never about that. In fact, when the no advantage principle was when we introduced the recommendations about Nauru, we said that we introduced a safeguard that people could be brought off if mental health or other reasons were there, and that they should be basically in Australia on the same basis as other people on bridging visas. At the time of producing that recommendation, bridging visa holders had work rights. So it was never a part of the panel's recommendation, and it wasn't. Should never have been tied to the no advantage principle. So they're just sort of context setting issues for around it. But can I also just make a couple of points, and then we can open up into questions, because that's probably a better way to deal with this. And you can tell me if what I just described about any of that made any sense to you. Some people have argued to us and written eloquently in their blogs and on websites things like, the answer is to establish a large processing centre in Indonesia and process large numbers of people out of Indonesia and give large numbers of visas as a consequence of that. There is a slight problem with that well-articulated point, and that is that Indonesia have said get stuffed. may seem like a small obstacle, but it's actually a very significant one. And the ability to get Indonesia engaged in that is only ever going to come out of building a proper, more functioning regional framework where they don't believe they're just going to be the magnet for everybody who's trying to get to Australia. Now, whether you want to agree with that view or not, that is their view. And in their view, the smuggling network is so much more sophisticated now, so much better organised, and so pervasive across the region that these sorts of things will just create bigger problems for them. Now, we can write about it as what they should do as much as we like, but it's their country and they make their own decisions about that. And that was one of the impediments for us. And to give you an example of how well sophisticated it is, I was in Jakarta recently trying to work on the regional capacity building program. And I'd like to talk about that later. And we met with the ambassador, and you all recall when bridging visas were announced and work rights were removed and people were granted the equivalent of 89% of special benefit, which many of us felt was just going to generate destitution, and we were quite outraged about. Over there it was marketed as, look, you're going to get a special payment from the government. And I pushed them on it, and that is how it was being marketed. You get a special payment from the government for this. And the Indonesians just went, you guys are just crazy. You're telling us you want us to lock everyone up, and now you're going to give them a special payment. So my point is that the politics and the perceptions and so forth are very complex and very difficult to grasp and come to grips with. The other point that people make to me often is that there are millions of refugees around the world. And some of you may have seen the YouTube clip that the department produced about the no advantage principle, which, if you saw a shooting star in that week heading towards Mars, that was me. It talked about things like, under no advantage, you will not get a visa any faster than anyone else in a refugee camp around the world. Well, apart from it being completely stupid, because if you heard that, you'd go, well, we might as well have a crack, because that's a very, very, very long time. 80% of the world's refugees stay on the borders of their country. 20% move on. The vast majority of them choose to move towards Europe. Of the ones that don't move towards Europe and head towards Australia, which is a smaller proportion again, they move through the region in different ways. This notion that you can conflate all of the figures at once and say, and then add it up and divide the number of resettlement places and say that's how long it's going to take for people to get a visa here is just wrong. And for people with a lot of years of experience in the sector that say it, I think it's dishonest. So there are different realities that you have to weigh up in this sort of stuff. And as I said, Karen wanted you to ask the hard questions. There are many hard questions that I don't even know I'm going to be able to answer, because this is a long way from perfect, and that's because there is nothing perfect when it comes to a wicked solution, a wicked problem. People keep saying to me it's not working. Well, people said that within the first week, and then within the first month. We're talking about rolling out and building a regional framework for asylum seekers that doesn't exist today, implementing a new 20,000 place program, and I keep trying to remind people that should progressively increase to 27,000 over the next 5 years, 4,000 new family reunion places specifically targeted to people who have arrived in this way, and that we could build all of that and get the message out and get the system working and build confidence in people's ability to have faith in that system and that it'll work for them. And everybody was critical of it after the first week, 2 weeks, month, it's still not working, 2 months, it's still not working. I don't know how many people have been involved in setting up small community organisations Does anyone remember the last time you could do that in 6 months or 3 months or a year? These things take time to build, and they take commitment and effort and collaboration from a wide range of people. And there are risks with doing this. There are serious, serious risks, and we're seeing some of them playing out now. But there are also very serious risks with not doing it. My greatest fear now is that we will lose virtually everything, and we can talk about that a bit later as well. So that's just some of the context setting, and I hope it gives you some idea of the complexity and the range of issues that we were trying to deal with. All of the information that we were trying to harness. And for me, it became very obvious that having looked at all the information, it was actually, I wasn't doing my job if I didn't take it on board, because the most important thing to me was to hold on to a position that I'd held on for years, even though there was information telling me something very different was taking place and more people were dying as a consequence of that. That was the position for me that I couldn't really accept. But there are nights where I wish I had off, I've got to say. I'm going to stop there, am I? Hopefully that gives you a sense of what it was we were trying to deal with. And as I said, you will have questions that I may or may not be able to answer, and there are flaws with what I'm talking about here as well. But that was the intent and the focus of the report.
Thanks, Paris. We have got lots of questions. We've been taking questions through Facebook and via the email. So we've just wound some of those questions into a couple of key questions to start us off, and then I'll open the floor for your questions. So start crafting your questions. Before we do that, I'll just by way of welcome, just check if there's any media in the room. Aquia's our media person. She's happy to set up some time for people with Paris afterwards. Is there any media in the room? No, okay, fab. We'll take our first question from Lida.
Thank you. Does this expert panel believes reports that more families are seeking asylum via boat because of the restriction to sponsoring families? Hasn't this had the opposite of the intended effect, and now there is increased danger for women and children?
It's a good question. The morning after the report was released, there was an academic who wrote a blog saying that the report had cut access to the family reunion program. I don't know how you get to be a professor or doctor or something if you don't read, but the report introduced 4,000 additional places. The wait in the SHP had gone to 21 years for family reunion under the Special Humanitarian Program, which meant vast numbers of people would never be reunited with their family again. The 4,000 place increase in the family reunion program was to create a pathway where they could get access much more quickly. Yes, they would have to pay, and there are some limitations on it as well, but for immediate family members, husbands, wives, children and so forth, the time frame should be virtually as quick as the old SHP program. That's what was intended. You're absolutely right to say that there is an increase in the number of families coming by boat, and it's a bit inexplicable, really. Whether people believe they've been cut off, family reunions been cut off, whether they believe there's about to be a change of government and TPVs will be reintroduced, permanent TPVs, or whatever the case may be. I'm not sure how it's being marketed. But the last figures I saw prior to Christmas, up to December, was the numbers had jumped from about 17 or 18% of arrivals being families to 30-something%. And in January and I think February, the figures were about 40%. So I can't explain to you the reason, but there's actually 4,000 additional places in the family migration stream for family reunion than there was beforehand, in addition to the 20,000 humanitarian places. It's not, people have to pay the application fees and so forth, and it can be convoluted, but that the intent was to provide more places. But I can't explain that change phenomenon. I don't know what's the basis of it.
Thanks, Paris. Amanola, you have a question?
My question is, the government has started a new social media campaign telling people that they should come only via correct route. Can you tell me, please, what's the correct route for the people seeking asylum from countries such as Afghanistan?
Yep.
Did everyone hear that question? So it was about the government has a social media campaign saying come by the correct route. What is the correct route, particularly for people seeking asylum?
Yes, we could have another whole session about national communications in this area, but I wish I had a PowerPoint screen so I could show you a photograph. What they mean is that they want people to use the increased places in the humanitarian program and the family reunion program, as opposed to risking their lives on boats. Now, but this is very tricky for people, for example, who are in Hazara town in Quetta, and for Hazaras in particular at the moment, the dangers of travelling outside of there to the UNHCR office, or if they have to travel to Islamabad for medical or another interview, or to Karachi or so forth. There are still quite serious risks for people trying to take the pathway. But what we're trying to do is build one and make changes to eliminate some of those risks or reduce them substantially. And I'll come to that. But the photograph I wanted to show you was of a plaza in Quetta, and there's one of our big billboard posts that we've got up there with a boat on it, and it's written on it, and the writing, I can't read it, but the writing says basically, don't risk your life coming to Australia by boat. And there's just been an explosion in the plaza, and people are carrying bodies that are bloodied, motorcycles that are on fire, and so forth. And it's an incredibly powerful image because, which is why spending the money that's been spent on this Don't Be Sorry campaign drives me insane. The only avenue is to provide proper, safer pathways for people to come, and we have to do it fast, and we have to be creative in how we're going about it. To DIAC's credit, and they get hammered a lot on this, everyone was freaked out about increasing the quota to 20,000 places, that they couldn't do it. They wouldn't be able to do it in this program year, and to his credit, the former Minister, Chris Bowen, pushed the department on it. I know the Department of Finance didn't want to do it. They wanted it to be 15,000 and so forth. And if we had have asked them several years ago, could you do it, they would have said no. But one of the panel recommendations was for $70 million a year in capacity building in the region. We haven't got 70 million yet. But of the first 10 million, 5 has gone to UNHCR. So they've just put on 18 additional staff in Pakistan, in Quetta. There are 7 of those staff are Hazaras. They're looking at doing video conferencing for interviews now, as opposed to requiring, because one of the risks was getting officials in to do the interviews. They're negotiating with IOM about whether they can establish a medical clinic in Quetta or establish panel doctors in Quetta, or how else could we do it to make it safer for people to do that using these resources. In Indonesia, they're putting on more staff in Indonesia in UNHCR to interview people. Now, I'm not sure if I'm meant to say this bit, so, I'll deny it, But in my discussions with them, when we asked them the impact, myself and Marianne Kenny and Marianne Lockery, we were there together, asked them what impact the increased funding through the panel recommendations would have on their processing times, which at the moment in Indonesia about 18 to 24 months. Their view was it will take them a little time to get the staff and to get the systems going, but when they had it up to speed, it should pull it back to around 6 to 9 months. And then we would have to add our time on top of that for whatever we're doing. It's a very different scenario. So the proper pathway has never existed before, and even with these recommendations, it creates a better pathway, but not a perfect one. And you know, my hope, and I should say, with the numbers in the humanitarian program this year and the number of Hazara Afghans who are eligible out of the family reunion quota, the 4,000, there are between 5,500 and 6,000 places available between now and the end of June. Now that's double, sometimes triple the number of boat arrivals of Afghans over the last few years, respectively. All who could get here safely, a large number of them flown for free. We have to get better at improving, work better for people. We have to get over the cultural difference between we like everything in order and we need birth certificates and death certificates and who else knows whatever they require and all of these sorts of things, and be more creative with our systems. But that is what is meant by, is what should be meant by, and it's not even coming the correct way, because coming by boat or using a people smuggler is not actually illegal. It's not, people aren't actually doing anything wrong. We didn't perceive it in that way. We just felt too many people are dying doing that. So how do we create a different way? We're working with the Afghan community, the Hazara Federation. We had a meeting here last night, a meeting in Perth, a meeting in Melbourne. There's one coming up in Sydney. To work with the community to communicate about this, to come up with ideas with the community about how we can help people move into this pathway so they don't have to take the risks, they don't have to spend that money. But we're up against a battle. Now, before anyone, when they ask me a question, says, yes, but Pakistan is very unstable and in 2014 troops are going to pull out of Afghanistan and that could create mass numbers of refugees, that is all absolutely true. But I've got to tell you, this report was never about that scale of activity, and the international community would have to find an international response to an event like that, like it's going to have to find to Syria now, or like it did with Kosovo in years gone by. You can't think of this sort of thing as being on the scale for dealing with those massive and potentially terrible sets of circumstances. So that, you know, that's what they intended to mean. If you're asking me a question as to whether I think they've done a very good job on it, I think it's crap. But you know, you should try and deal with national communications in dialogue. It's not an easy thing to do. So, but hopefully with the community, we'll find better ways to deal with that.
Thanks. And Rubén, question?
Thank you. How's the Department of Immigration deciding who will be released into the Australian community on bridging visas or community detention, and who will be sent to Nauru or Manus Island? Thank you.
It's an extremely good question, and it's one of those ones that I can't answer because I can't work it out myself.
Well, tell us about what the panel's intention was about that.
Well, the panel didn't envisage that there would be an immediate resolution or anything to this sort of stuff. It always knew that it would take. We always believed it would take time. You had to put things in place. You had to allow them to get set up. You had to let them work, and then you had to be able to communicate and give people confidence that it's going to work. The problem that they had was the numbers were increasing dramatically, and I'm trying to think about what I can say here. And in particular, there was a very rapid surge in arrivals from Sri Lanka. Exponential, the curve was inverted. And the views about who was involved in organising that are very interesting, as to who was actually involved in facilitating the travel. I don't know for sure, but some people who've arrived describe the Sri Lankan Navy escorting boats into international waters. There are all sorts of views about that. You can read about that in the Australian newspaper. I'm not revealing that. So the numbers of arrivals were overwhelming the places that were available, even just for short periods of time in detention centre. The capacity to accommodate large numbers in the community at the pace that they were arriving was going to be a challenge for the sector. I think the sector would have found a way to deal with it. The options around Nauru, Manus and Malaysia were not set up and established yet. So, in a sense, the government, in responding to the politics of this and trying to deal with a surge in arrivals, went with Nauru and Manus, in my view, before it was set up properly. So no one could tell me that Nauru and Manus is operating in the way in which the panel recommended at the moment. They're just not. And it's extremely troubling to me the length of time it's taking for that to take place. I think Nauru is going to get there quicker than Manus Island will get there. And I have other views about that, which I'm happy to share with you. But there's no clear, coherent process for that selection. And I think there's problems with the selection as well. But it's complex, and that's a question I would love you to put to DIAC, because they're responsible for making those decisions.
And I think Robert Hoytink is having some community forums, so we might make sure that we take that question into one of those forums. I know that Father Pan Jordan from the Tamil community has a question he'd like to ask.
This particular panel, this particular panel, I'm not sure, touch upon those countries that are producing refugees, and why are they producing refugees? For example, Hazara community or Sri Lankan Tamils, why they take such a risk? That means something very serious happening on the ground there, that particular country. Why the government is not directly or indirectly speak the human rights abuse as an atrocity committed by these countries very regularly, even today?
The panel had no qualms whatsoever about that. We're in complete agreement that the crises are being produced in certain countries for particular reasons. I think the Australian government in certain situations is a strong advocate around human rights, in others not so strong. People match the surge in arrivals from Sri Lanka to, this is in some articles that I've read, to the point at which Australia in fact co-sponsored a recommendation or something to do with the human rights situations in Sri Lanka. And within a very short period of time, the numbers of arrivals from Sri Lanka went like that. And that's where I think some of the press articles speculated that it was retaliation for Australia supporting that. Now, there's speculation about all of that, of course, and I don't know if it's true or not. But Australia's not the most powerful or influential country in the world by a long shot on these issues. We like to think we might be, but we're not. I'm hoping that a seat on the Security Council might give us a bit more clout on those sorts of issues, and we should be raising those concerns. But you take Afghanistan, come 2014, I don't know what the international community is doing now about planning for that date, but it seems to me to be bizarre if there's no planning going on. Because our ability to tell the government of Afghanistan that they shouldn't do this, or the Taliban that they shouldn't target this group, is virtually zilch. So the diplomacy route is a very slow and difficult one, unfortunately. But we weren't really concerned with that. That wasn't what we were trying to respond to in the panel.
Thanks, Paris. So we've talked about the no advantage principle, talked about work rights, we've talked about Manus and Nauru, but I know that people will have a lot more questions about that. Who'd like to ask the first question?
Thank you to this forum. And my question is today, did the expert panel recommend no work rights for asylum seekers who arrived post-August 13? If not, why has the government made this decision?
The answer is no. The panel did not make that recommendation. And in trying to explain the no advantage principle to you earlier, I was trying to explain how it's not consistent with what the thinking was behind that. At the end of the day, when you produce a report and you give it to a government, though, they implement it. It's not, the panel has nothing to do with the implementation. And they implement it in the way in which they can, and there are some serious blockers to them being able to implement all 22 recommendations. So the government's accepted them all, but some require legislation, and it would require the support of either the Coalition or the Greens to make them happen, particularly some of the ones around Malaysia that might lead to something happening with Indonesia and so forth. So it's not that the government hasn't wanted to introduce or implement all of the recommendations, it just hasn't been able to. There have been some perversions, though, of what was reported on by us in order to justify a particular response. And I don't think it's entirely deliberate. I think some of those concepts are vague and they are difficult to explain and work out. But the Minister said they introduced it in response specifically to the surge in arrivals from Sri Lanka. And he said that because their intel and from the initial information that they were gathering was that the vast majority at that time were people who were being sold through the smuggling networks, passage on boats, on the basis that they would have access to work rights. So if their claim was being processed for a few years, they would have access to work rights, be able to earn money, send that money back home, because many of them were very poor. They were quite poor. The problem with that is that we've ended up with a generic policy now that affects absolutely everyone, and even within the Tamil community or the Sri Lankan community, because there was quite a few Sinhalese that were coming in those periods as well. There's still quite a few people who are refugees, and then the Afghan community is also affected by the same general principle and so forth. And so, I have real concerns about it, and the Minister announced that he would look at certain aspects of it again, but that was what I was led to believe the reason why they introduced that. It was to remove the ability for people to gain access to work. And I can tell you what, my understanding was, if you're an Afghan, it can cost you about $20,000, I think, to get to Australia. Out of Sri Lanka, the prices were $400, and the additional money was to be paid off when you were able to work. Some said it even got down to zero on the basis that a certain percentage of people would get through and be able to work, and that they would still make a profit doing it that way. This is what was being said. There was a lot of information. This is what I've been told by the government. I haven't seen all of the information, and that was the basis on which they made that decision. So that's the best I can answer that one.
Hassan Ghulam.
I'm surprised you've
It
got
is
a question.
very, very obvious. You have done a great job. You did have a great input, including all other experts, but politicians are tired because they can't handle it. The Australian public is sick and tired of this policy shifting, swapping, changing, subdividing, and overexposing, doing this and that. And the refugee communities are also tired of it.
Yep.
That means that this phenomenon grew out of proportion. It is overflowing. It is getting sour. Nobody can handle it. It is like a very basic mathematical question, overcomplicated. Let's go back to the basics. Drop all these fiddling, divide, work right, no work right. You can have a house, no, you should go to the hostel. Imagine, okay, Australian economy can afford. What about days that the Australian economy will be going down? Another half a public servant will be sacked. These refugees at the detention center and no service. So these
So
are
going into
really issues
territory
we
the panel
have
wasn't
to
even
go.
close to.
We have to go to the back to the basic. Simply say, simply say, either this is the center, Indonesia, Malaysia, Dubai. You come from there. If you are coming from this state, you will be sent back automatically home, no matter what is your claim. You have to draw the line. Don't play with refugees. I mean, everybody is playing with their lives, with their existence.
So, is
It's all right.
the question? Yeah.
I can. All I'll say to that, Hassan, is that you're absolutely right to say everybody's had enough, and that there's the politics around this is grotesque. I couldn't believe when the report was released how many people could reinterpret the same words in the press in so many different ways. It was unbelievable. I'm thinking, am I hearing, is it the same report that I was involved in? The distortions are incredible, including from within the sector, including from the opposition, including from the Greens, including from some sources in government as well. So you're absolutely right. And we've got to do better. That's not me, is it?
Yes, that's right.
Oh shit, sorry. Oh dear. I better answer that one later. So you're right, but it's also not as straightforward because you can't send a lot of people back. If you're a Palestinian, you can't just say you're going back to where you came from. If you're Iranian, the government can't simply just force an Iranian back unless they are prepared to cooperate with a return, because the Iranian government won't accept them back. I think we also weren't looking for a zero number of asylum seekers when we produced this report. We accept that that's not going to ever be the case. But it is complex. It's not straightforward. It's difficult for people to simply say you're going to return people to Iraq. But the reality is you can't do that without processing someone's claim anyway. If they say that they want to seek asylum, you have to process their claim. Now, we've pushed it into a regional processing arrangement. But what we were recommending was a whole series of safeguards to ensure that anyone could still have their claim processed fairly. So it's just not that straightforward, Hassan, but I do understand the sentiment, and I do agree with the sentiment as well.
We have time for about 4 or 5 other questions. I'd encourage you, if you've got a question, chances are somebody else in the room has that same question. So I'd really encourage, particularly the people who don't usually speak in these forums, to jump up and ask a question, because chances are other people will appreciate it as well. Freddie's not one of those people, but I'm going to let her ask a question. She always asks questions.
Very much. Is that on? Yeah. Paris, the grotesque politics, the confusion, the ignorance, the biased media, the misinterpretation. When are we going to get plain English explanation that it is a human right to seek asylum? You said it, your report says it, but most of the people, the politicians, and even some of my former refugee friends are confused about coming the wrong way, coming in the back door. When are we going to clean this up with clear communication? Is there anything in your report that will lead to better plain speaking about this very, very horrible issue? And if I might, as a former immigration officer, I know that the Department of Foreign Affairs and senior diplomats like Lestrange, your colleague on this panel, were always very dismissive of immigration and operated in isolation from them. In our region, is Foreign Affairs now taking on a stronger role in the relationship with UNHCR, with the governments in our region, in relation to asylum seeking?
DIAC still takes on the primary role with UNHCR. And like I said before, the feedback that I've had about the work that's being done to get the capacity up to filling the quota is very impressive. They get a bad rap all of the time, but they need to get a decent rap and recognition for what they're trying to put in place here. 18 months ago, couldn't have got it done. And to the government's credit, you have to really, I might be critical of certain things, but on this one, they said they would go to 20,000. They announced it within 2 weeks of the report being released, and they said that they would still meet the 20,000 in this program year, even though there were a few months in, and they're going to do that, I think. So on that front, you really have to give them credit. I'm still waiting for questions about Nauru and Manus. If you don't ask any, I'll have to bring it up myself. So Freddie, you and Foreign Affairs, there is more activity around the Bali process and those sorts of things. Whether it's enough, I don't know. There does seem to be a bit more cooperation at those levels. But DIAC is still certainly the primary organiser, and with the regional capacity building money that we got and that we're trying to put in place now, a lot that's being implemented by DIAC. So we just came back from Indonesia. There are 270 unattached minors in Indonesian detention centres, and they don't get released because they're minors and there's no services that the Indonesians provide. So their answer is to keep them in detention. Now, one of the programs that Marianne Lockery and Marianne Kenny and myself are trying to support with DIAC and UNHCR and IOM is a program to get all of those kids out of detention using this capacity building money, put them in the community and support them in Indonesia. And for the first time, DIAC has agreed that they will resettle UAMs out of Indonesia as a consequence of that. We're debating the numbers, but for the first time. And if we could get the same thing out of Malaysia, that would be good, because there's 200 kids in Malaysian detention centres as well. And that we're looking at, there's work being done around NGOs being funded to provide a similar type program with UNHCR in Malaysia. So there are some very good and important things that can come out of the relationship between DIAC and Foreign Affairs with those countries. But it's slow because, I don't know the exact figure, but in Indonesia, they've got a population of 220 million, and I don't know, is it 200 million or something, live on $2 a day and less? they've got other issues that they think are fairly important for them as well. So, and they really don't like us telling them that ours are more important. So, but it's a challenge, that whole relationship thing.
Just
Sonia was going to ask.
Just like to acknowledge the significance of that too, Paris. You know, there hasn't been a resettlement pathway for unaccompanied minors, so that's quite enormous out of this work, really.
Well,
like, it might be small, but
we haven't got it yet.
that's,
But if we do, I think Marion Kenny's going to dance a jig. But
yeah,
it's
that would be very significant.
well, it's small but still significant.
Yeah.
And you know, I sat down with about 50 asylum seekers in Jakarta who were in an IOM hostel. 45 of them, I think, were Afghan. 42 were Afghan. Many had been in Indonesia for 2-3 years. Some had been in detention there for 18 months, 2 years. Some had been on boats that sunk and they survived and got back. They were being supported by IOM in a hostel that, as a consequence of the recommendations, they've all been interviewed. They're all waiting their character and health clearance now, and they'll all get here fairly soon, as will another 700 this program year. And if we could push it up higher, I'd be trying to push it up higher again. You know, and what was really clear to me is that the people, if there is a real pathway, if there's a real alternative, they would prefer to take that than risk their lives. And there's evidence there that if you provide that option to stabilise populations and are effective in providing a pathway, people will take it. I mean, I came away from that both enthused and despairing, because I was enthused by seeing what they were doing and that this could work. UNHCR also, when they told us about their processing times, they said they were being told to prepare similar arrangements as to the Malaysia arrangement at that point in time as well. But I was despairing, because I think we're going to lose 90% of it now, because there hasn't been enough concerted effort to capitalise on the opportunity to try to prove that you can do it differently and that it can work differently, and that we don't have to do this stupid deterrence, punitive, punishing type stuff that we go on with and the language that we go on with. So I left with mixed feelings after that trip, I've got to say.
Thanks, Paris. So, Sonia, have you got the hard question about Nauru and Manus? Okay.
Paris, another small but significant win for the people involved was the resettlement of 18 Cubans from Guantanamo Bay. And they were from the immigration side, not enemy combatants, and I've been advising them. And one of the most significant things about this is that that's an offshore processing facility, and for the first time UNHCR conducted the RSD and the resettlement. Yeah. There are serious concerns, as you're aware, about Nauru and Manus, and it looks like on Guantanamo Bay in the period of 18 months was able to find a durable solution for people who hit the sea by boat to get to the US. Nothing's happening in terms of RSD and resettlement on Manus, and you're chairing a committee that oversights issues in relation to those. And when Chris Bowen announced it, he said, we're going to be different from previous operations. We're going to be transparent. There's been very little information. Can you give us an update on what this committee has been able to achieve? For Nauru and Manus, the Joint Advisory Committee recommended in your report, and the interim one.
Well,
and just to explain to people that RSD means processing of people's claims. Yeah.
Thanks for that, Sonia. First of all, I don't chair the interim advisory group. That's chaired by Wendy Southern from DIAC and Dominic, I've forgotten his last name, a Nauruan minister. There isn't one established for Manus yet, and it's a very serious issue for me. And those difficulties relate to the Papua New Guinean government's attitude towards it. And we can come back to that. The group that's met around Nauru, we recommended an advisory group and oversight group in the report. My concern was that people were starting to be transferred, that the conditions weren't right, and there wasn't an advisory group. And when I raised this concern with the Minister, which is one of those things that you always regret, he said, well, why can you help in an interim capacity with some members from the council that I do chair to work with the department and the Nauruan government to establish something in the interim and then report back about what it should likely look like in the long term. I didn't really want to do it because I've got enough to manage at the moment, but I was too concerned that there was no oversight going on at all. One of the outcomes of that, I think, and Joe Boardman and Nicola from the department are at the back of the room, they've been resourcing that group and have done an amazing job, really. But from a slow start, what has happened is that we have pushed very hard for timelines around the establishment of application assistance and the commencement of processing, which was dragging on and on in an unacceptable way. Am I allowed to make any announcements, Joe? Processing on Nauru will commence in the next few weeks. Application assistance, people being able to prepare their applications should commence in the next few weeks. Training for decision makers is commencing alongside that. The deployments of staff to Nauru to assist with that process and the interview teams are being put in place. A registry has been established. Nauru has an act for it, and they've got to put in place the review mechanism as well. And that the interim advisory group has been very focused on trying to get that going, because that's the primary concern for people. The other issue, obviously, is the quality of the accommodation, which, whether you think people are okay in tents for a little while or not is one thing. Whether they're okay for 6 or 7 months in those conditions is a whole other question. I have to say DIAC has been working as hard as they can to get some of this stuff in place, but you've got to deal with another government in this instance as well, and it's not the most straightforward exercise. So what the interim group is really focused on is pushing the issue about the accommodation, sites for the accommodation and for it to be built quickly and appropriately, pushing for the processing to commence as an absolute priority. There is now legislation or regulations that would allow freedom of movement, because the panel recommendation said no arbitrary detention. You can't, in my view, people on Nauru and Manus are being arbitrarily detained at the moment, which is in contradiction to the panel recommendations. So what we're trying to do is push on all of those fronts, and I think on Nauru we're getting there after what I think is an unsatisfactory start. But without the advisory group, I think it could have kept slipping. And people like Marianne Kenny are liaising with UNHCR and are looking to put together a subgroup that would help monitor the RSD system and ensure that it rolls along in an appropriate way. Nicholas Proctor is chairing a health and mental health subgroup that's already produced one report about after a visit, but they need to get other members onto that subgroup. So we're kind of working away, trying to hold everyone to account for implementing it in accordance with all the safeguards recommended in the panel. And as I said, it's progressing very well in Nauru. Sorry, it's been I think a completely unsatisfactory start at Nauru, but it's moving in the right direction. On Manus Island, I have a completely different view about it, and I have very serious concerns that we've raised. One of them is that there is no oversight group. The other is there's no processing, and PNG is not that close to having an act out yet. And then there are the issues to do with children being detained. There's nowhere in this report that says you should detain a kid. Isn't it? It says you shouldn't detain anyone, actually. So you know, I've got very serious concerns about Manus. I know the department does, and I've had this conversation with the new minister, Brendan O'Connor, and I think he is giving it considerable thought, and I'd be very hopeful we'll see some shifts in what's going on with Manus very soon. And if it doesn't, then I don't think anyone can claim it's remotely close to what was being recommended by the panel. And therefore, and the government's policy is the implementation of the 22 recommendations. So I would be encouraging people to hold it to account for its own policy. And I know you've done that in different forums before.
Because the report doesn't talk about Nauru and Manus as being detention centres, does it?
No, it's very specific. There should be no arbitrary detention.
Yeah.
I can pull it out for you if you want, and I'll read it to you.
If you like.
My personal view is that it's so broken that renewed pressure from all levels should be brought onto UNHCR to reconsider its non-involvement.
Well, Sonia, if you could find a way to convince UNHCR to get involved, I'll take you out to dinner, I'll do whatever you want to do.
I'm using Guantanamo now as the template to bring as much pressure as I can.
I'm immensely despairing of UNHCR. This is, can I qualify that by saying I've had a very long relationship with them. I've got lots of friends who work there. But I know Nauru and Manus was difficult for everyone to swallow. It's very difficult for me to swallow, but it was like when the N-word was mentioned, a switch flipped in everyone's head and we couldn't conceive that we could do it differently. I had lunch with a kid who was 13 when he went to Nauru last time. He had no guardian. He was accommodated with adults. He spent a period of time in a lockup as a 13-year-old on his own after incidents at the centre. None of us could get a visa to go to Nauru, let alone amnesty being allowed into the centre to visit people. There were no NGOs engaged to provide services last time round. There was no legal assistance provided to people. There was no adequate review mechanism. There was no oversight, interim oversight. My sense was that as difficult as it is to confront that, why not only UNHCR, but why don't all of us get on with making it work? Why don't all of us get on with saying no advantage does not mean you're going to be there for 5 years? Never meant that, would never stated that, shouldn't have to be that. Let's make it function effectively and as fairly as we can while we build better regional processes. But I can't get anyone to listen to it, to be honest.
To finish up, I wanted to particularly just note some of the fantastic work that's come out of the expert panel's report. I mean, obviously there's a whole range of things that are controversial and are debatable, and sometimes the devil's in the detail, sometimes there's challenges with implementation. So there's all of that, and I'm not wanting to minimise that around the expert panel's report, but there has also been some very significant things that this sector has been fighting for over more than 10 years. Peak organisations like the Refugee Council have for the last 10 years been recommending an increase to significant numbers, around 20,000 in the humanitarian program, and the expert panel's work achieved that. It also achieved an increase in the family migration program, particularly targeted at people on refugee visas, to 4,000 places. So sometimes all of this work cannot be very grounded, but our daily work is actually about people. And so to finish up today, I wanted to ask Aleha and his family to come forward. Aleha and his beautiful wife.
I just want to say one thing.
Yeah.
Sorry, Aleha, just 1 sec. I'm sorry, Karen. I just want to say one thing, and I don't mean to end on a desponding note. But what was recommended by the panel had some controversial things in it, very difficult things. Excising the mainland, a lot of people went into orbit. There's only 200 people that have landed on the mainland in the last 5 years. I just wanted to say something about that. when we adopted that ethical position, when we established where we fell in that ethical conundrum, it just became illogical to leave something in place that would encourage people, smugglers, to leave people on the water for days or weeks longer than they would have been, and therefore increase the risk of life. That was the only the risk of people drowning. That was the only rationale for that. I know there are serious issues that we have to be incredibly vigilant about, but what we look like losing is the increase in the quota, going back down to 13,750, the 4,000 family reunion places. We won't see the $70 million per annum for capacity building in the region. These are all things that many of us have fought and struggled for many, many years to try to get that in place, let alone increasing to 27,000 places. You know, we're looking down the barrel of TPV, permanent TPVs. We're looking down the barrel of all sorts of things. And I would just ask people to consider that with all the difficulties and the challenges that this represents, is maintaining where we've been the best and going backwards the best way to go. Is it really impossible for us to capture the recommendations here and make them work on every level in a way that protects thousands more people every year? When I gave a talk a little while ago, and what I was hoping that in 10 years' time I would buy a number of people, friends of mine, tickets to the AFL Grand Final so that they could see the crowd, which would be it would be about 10 or 12,000 people less than the number of additional refugees that would have been protected if these recommendations were implemented fully. So when you watch the Grand Final next year, or if you can remember watching it, and you see the camera pan across that massive crowd, that's how many additional people. That's not even if we don't have to go to 27,000 a year to get to that. That's how many additional people would be protected. So I just put that to you because it's a challenge. We don't think we got everything right. We had 6 weeks to come up with a template that should be built on and improved on and enhanced. And if there were some things that were terrible, should be ditched. But we have to start from somewhere. And all I've seen since the report was released is everybody get further into their trenches. And the only ones who are going to suffer in that are going to be refugees in the future. So I just leave that with you as a thought to ponder. And I hope, can I say thanks, Karen, and to everybody for coming today, because these aren't easy issues. Thank you for your questions. And I hope, I'm not expecting everybody to agree with what we came up with at all. And I'd love people to keep challenging it and to do that and find ways to build on it. But I hope you understand a bit more about what the panel was contending with and trying to achieve.
Thank you, Paris. Your time has been invaluable. As I was about to say, there are all of these additional places in the family migration program. That has a face, and Alea and his family are one of those faces. They've recently been reunited, and Alea has seen his baby in the last 2 weeks for the first time, and they'd like to come forward and just give you a gift on behalf of all of us to thank you for your attendance here today.